Here's another example from Chapter 6, trying to focus on the tax burden. So we have a demand curve, we have a supply curve, and a tax of $24 is placed on suppliers for each unit they sell. We want to know what's the result. What's the price to the consumer? What's the price to the seller? As well as we'd like to be able to calculate the tax burden on the producer and on the consumer. So first off, let's draw our demand curve. I'm going to draw the downward sloping demand curve. So it's going to cross the y-axis at 150. 150 divided by 5 is going to be 30. The supply curve is going to start at 30, but it's going to be much more flat because it has a slope of just 1 as opposed to -5. So I'm just going to draw it that way. Probably should draw it a little more sloped, but hey, look, now it's sloped. Okay, now it's flat. All right, well, we'll try to work with this anyways. Okay, so the first step we want to find is what is the equilibrium price and quantity. So I set 150 minus 5Q equal to 30 plus Q. Subtract 30 from each side, so I get 120. Add 5Q to each side, so I get 6Q. Divide by 6. Q star is equal to 20. So there we have 20. Now I just plug that back into my supply or demand, and you'll see both will give me a P star of 50. So I'm going to graph this out. Somewhere around here, and P star, I just broke my pen, it looks like, is 50. Oh, now we're back and running. Sweet. All right, now we want to look to see what happens. So here we place a tax on the supplier of $24. So that's going to take our supply curve and add 24. So our new supply curve is going to equal 54 plus Q. And so to graph that out is now my new intercept is going to be at 54. And it's going to have that same slope as before. And so there's my new supply curve, where this tax difference here is a difference of $24. Now I find where that supply curve hits the original demand curve. I bring that down, and this is going to be my new Q tax. I find that by setting my original demand equation, 150 minus 5Q, equal to my new supply equation, which is the red, which is 54 plus Q. So I subtract 54 from each side. So I get 96 is equal, add 5Q to each side, 6Q. Then I divide each side by 6. So Q with the tax is equal to 16. So now my new quantity is 16. Now there's two different prices involved here. One price is here, and this is going to be the price to the consumer, and the other price is where that quantity touches the demand curve right here, and this is price to the seller. Okay, where that's going to intersect the original supply equation. So to find that, so the price to the consumer is equal to, take 16 and plug it into the demand equation, 150 minus 5 times 16, 50 minus 5 times 16, I'm doing this on my calculator, not my head, sorry. This is equal to 70. The price to the seller is equal to, we put 16 into the original supply equation, 30 plus 16, that equals 46. Notice the difference between these two is 24, which it should be. So here we have price to the consumer is 76, price to the seller is 46. And so that's the result. Right, is that the consumers will pay $70 for the unit, 24 of that will go to taxes, 46 will go to the producer. Now the question is, well, what happens to the tax burden? Well, the tax burden can be separated into two different areas. The first area is the difference in the price that would have been received by the seller, and it's going to be this whole triangle right here. So without a tax, or it's a rectangle, sorry, though it might look a little triangle-ish. Without a tax, the seller was receiving $50, but now they're receiving $46. So the tax burden on the producer is 50 minus 46 times the quantity, 16, which is 4 times 16. I could probably do that in my head, but I don't want to get it wrong. 64. So that's the tax burden on the producer. The tax burden on the consumer is the price that the consumer was paying, 50, and it's going to be this whole rectangle up here. So the tax burden on the consumer is the price the consumer is now paying minus the price they would have paid without a tax times the number 16. So we get 20 times 16, and there the tax burden is 320. Now notice that this tax burden really is trying to tell us, how do we divvy up the tax revenue? Because the tax revenue is equal to 70 minus 46, or the size of the tax, times the number of units sold. So we get 24 times 16, which is 384. And notice that the tax burden of the consumer and producer add up to the tax revenue. So among the $384 of taxes being paid, 320 of it's really coming from the consumer, or is the burden placed on the consumer compared to what would have happened without the tax, and 64 of it is being placed on the producer compared to what would have happened without the tax. And so that's how we then separate the tax burden. And the question is, why is it that the consumer faces a larger tax burden than the producer? And in this case, it has to do with the relative elasticities. Notice that the slope on the demand curve is -5. It's much steeper. The slope on the supply curve is just 1. So because this demand curve has a greater slope than the supply curve, the tax burden will fall upon the consumer. If it were reverse and the supply curve had a steeper slope, the tax burden would fall more on the supplier. If they had the same slope, they would share the tax burden equally.